What if I told you that one of England's most charming, beloved kings didn't die with dignity, but rotted from the inside out while his doctors blistered his skin, bled him dry and fed him poisons they called cures? That beneath the silk robes and royal smiles was a body slowly drowning in its own bile. This isn't a myth. It's a medical horror story buried beneath polished portraits and palace lies. And once you hear what really happened to Charles II, you'll never look at royalty or history the same way again. The scene was grotesque. February 1685. In the royal bedchamber of Whitehall Palace, King Charles II convulsed violently on sweat-soaked sheets. His abdomen was grotesquely distended, as if his own body had turned traitor. Then came the bile, thick, black, and reeking, projected from his mouth in violent spasms. Servants recoiled. The air stank of decay. Physicians surrounded him in chaos. Leeches clung to his arms, drawing dark, sluggish blood. Hot irons hissed against blistered skin. Enemas were forced into him with crude brass syringes. Nothing worked. His pulse was erratic, his breath shallow. His eyes flicked open just long enough to whisper, "I'm all flame," before another wave of pain seized him. This wasn't a quiet royal passing. This was a king dying in torment, his insides breaking down in real time. Behind the velvet drapes, panic gripped the palace. Nobles whispered of poison. Some believed it was divine punishment. But the truth was more brutal. His organs were failing, his kidneys overwhelmed, his bowels bloated, his stomach releasing sludge. The King of England was decomposing while still alive. His skin darkened, his legs swelled, his urine turned black. With each breath, a sour stench rose from his body. Nothing in the royal physician's arsenal could stop what was happening. Not the ancient herbs, not the blistering plasters, not the prayers. Charles II, once hailed as the laughing, lustful, merry monarch, was reduced to a leaking husk, his death a slow-motion implosion. And while England waited for a word from the throne, the man on it was dissolving from the inside out. His death would be remembered not for its dignity, but for its horror. The rot had begun, and there would be no escape. The masked corpse. What the public never saw. When Charles II finally died, it wasn't with ceremony. It was with haste. His body, still warm, was stripped and cleaned by shaking hands. The stench was overwhelming. Embalmers worked in silence, their faces pale as they packed his bloated corpse with herbs to mask what no perfume could truly hide. His skin had darkened to a sickly purple. His limbs were swollen and tight, the flesh stretched like overfilled sacks. Fluid leaked from his nose and mouth. The public never saw it. Instead, he was laid in state behind thick velvet curtains. Only a pale wax mask, painted to resemble royal serenity, was placed above the body. Courtiers entered the chamber one by one, nodding solemnly, pretending not to notice the pungent air or the guards quietly dabbing its seepage along the bier. Rumors swirled. Some said his skin had begun to blister. Others whispered about the color of his hands, blackened like charred wood. The real horror was revealed in the autopsy. Inside the king was a nightmare, his stomach lined with ulcerated tissue, his intestines inflamed, and his bowels bloated with black, gangrenous sludge. His kidneys were misshapen, his liver discolored, and his bladder disintegrating. The surgeons recorded their findings in cold Latin, but even their sterile notes couldn't disguise the rot. Charles hadn't simply died. He had decomposed alive. What the public saw was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion of peace. But behind the royal drapes, England's sovereign was little more than a swollen carcass dressed in silk. The grandeur of kingship had collapsed under the weight of his own decay. And though his legacy would be painted in gold, his final portrait was etched in black. 3. From Restoration to Ruin. Charles's Rise. In 1660, England cheered as Charles II returned to claim his throne. After years of Cromwell's Puritan rule, grey clothing, banned music, and joyless sermons, the nation craved colour, and Charles delivered. He rode into London amid cheering crowds, a tall, dark-eyed king with charm, wit, and promises of merriment. The Restoration had begun, and with it came masques, music, and a royal court dripping with scandal and indulgence. Charles welcomed it all. His days were filled with political games, his nights with wine, oysters, and women. He kept a string of mistresses, fathered over a dozen illegitimate children, and held banquets that stretched till dawn. Laughter echoed through Whitehall, but so did coughing fits and unexplained stomach cramps. He brushed them off. Nothing serious, he'd say. But inside, his body was accumulating damage with every passing year. Gluttony had its price. He overate, overdrank, and slept too little. His physicians gave him mercury pills for syphilis, lead powders for headaches, and enemas for everything else. These were poisons, not cures, each dose corroding him from within. His body absorbed the toxins in silence. He was still young, still handsome, but his complexion dulled. His breath soured. He began to sweat excessively and complained of inward heat. The signs were there. No one looked too closely. Behind the glittering facade, Charles was a man crumbling in slow motion. He had restored a kingdom, but neglected his own flesh. The indulgence that made him beloved would become his undoing. Every celebration, every rich feast, every night tangled in silk sheets added another crack to the structure. By the time the rot surfaced, it was too late. The king who saved England was already dying, just not fast enough for anyone to notice. Fourth, a court of sin and splendor, poison from within. Charles II ruled over a palace of pleasure. Whitehall pulsed with life, masquerades, banquets, gambling, and a rotating cast of mistresses. Courtiers mimicked his habits, indulgence without restraint. Plates piled high with venison and oysters, tankards of wine flowing like rivers. The king was the heartbeat of it all, witty, magnetic, insatiable. But beneath the silks and laughter, rot was taking root. Charles's appetite was legendary, but so was his recklessness. He ignored minor ailments, dismissed cramps, and endured burning fevers without pause. He believed his body would obey him as readily as his subjects. Instead, it turned on him. Repeated venereal infections went untreated or were cured with mercury, a substance that slowly poisoned his nervous system. When his bowels cramped, he was fed laxatives soaked in wine. When he complained of the heat within, physicians bled him, weakening him further. His meals did more harm than good. Rich, fatty meats and endless alcohol inflamed his gut. By the 1670s, he was experiencing daily discomfort, but instead of slowing down, he doubled down. More feasts, more wine, more remedies drawn from medieval superstition and foreign quackery. The royal physicians, eager to please, prescribed concoctions of opium, antimony, and crushed pearls. Each promised balance. None delivered. Instead, they disrupted his digestion, burdened his kidneys, and masked the symptoms as the infection grew deeper. For years, Charles lived like a man invincible. But inside, his intestines were inflaming, his organs weakening, and bacteria spreading through tissue never allowed to heal. This was not a sudden illness. It was decades of negligence, arrogance, and poison, disguised as pleasure and medicine. By the time anyone realized, the damage was irreversible. His body had become its own executioner, and the court that cheered his decadence would soon watch it consume him. 5. The day his face turned grey. It began without warning. In the middle of a council meeting, Charles II rose to speak. He paused, blinked, then swayed. His ministers froze. The king's face had lost all color, ashen, slack, as if life were draining from him in real time. His eyes rolled back. His knees buckled. A guard lunged forward just in time to catch him before he hit the floor. Silence fell across the chamber. Charles gasped, struggling to breathe, his hands trembling as he clutched his stomach. Courtiers rushed to close the doors, shielding the scene from public eyes. A chair was brought, his body slumped into it like dead weight. Sweat poured from his brow. He whispered something unintelligible, lips dry and cracked. Physicians were summoned. They examined him quickly and declared it a fainting spell. He was moved to his bedchamber and ordered to rest. But behind closed doors, the truth was clearer. Something was breaking down inside him. The king had not fainted. He had faltered under the weight of hidden disease. This wasn't the first time. In private, Charles had complained of stabbing abdominal pain, dizziness, and waves of heat that left him drenched and shaking. These episodes came and went, unexplained. Each time he returned to court smiling, as if nothing had happened. But each collapse grew worse. Each recovery took longer. What the court witnessed that day wasn't a fluke. It was a signal. His body was bloating with internal decay, organs swollen, blood thick, toxins building with no exit. The facade was cracking. Behind the robes, the jewels, and the crown was a man being hollowed out from within. The king still ruled, but his flesh had declared war, and it was gaining ground with every passing hour. 6. Doctors or executioners. The medical torture begins. The moment Charles collapsed for the final time, his physicians moved like butchers. In one day they bled him 58 times. Veins in his arms, feet, even behind his ears were opened. His sheets soaked with blood, his pulse weakening with each cut. They believed illness was imbalance, and the cure was to drain him until the body reset. But Charles had no balance left to spare. Mustard plasters were slapped onto his chest, searing the skin. Blisters were raised deliberately, great, bubbling welts meant to draw the evil humors to the surface. Hot irons were pressed against the soles of his feet, a barbaric attempt to awaken failing organs. The king writhed, his teeth clenched so hard they cracked. Between moans he rasped, "I am all flame." Purgatives came next, violent laxatives forced into his mouth and rectum. He retched until his throat bled. Enemas followed, syringes of scalding fluid injected again and again, flooding his bowels already ravaged by infection. The stench of sickness filled the palace. Servants gagged. One fainted. His belly distended like a drum. His skin turned patchy and erupted in sores. Blackened ulcers bloomed along his spine. His body shook uncontrollably, muscles firing in pain or protest, no one knew which. Nothing helped, everything hurt, and yet the treatments continued, not because they worked, but because the doctors had nothing else. Medieval science masquerading as care, they called it healing. In truth, they were accelerating the end. The King of England, once the symbol of restoration, now lay broken, his body bruised, burnt, and bleeding from every orifice. No poison had done this, no enemy's blade, just a league of learned men, killing him by inches in the name of medicine. 7. The royal body turns against itself. Charles II wasn't dying from a single wound. He was collapsing under the slow betrayal of his own organs. Modern scholars suspect chronic gastrointestinal disease, advanced kidney failure, or uremia, a fatal buildup of toxins in the blood when the kidneys shut down. By the final week, his urine had turned thick and black, more sludge than liquid. His bowels stopped functioning entirely. Days passed without movement. Pressure built in his abdomen, stretching the skin tight, making even the weight of a sheet unbearable. The fluid pooling inside him reeked of decay, but his mind remained clear. That was the cruelty. He was aware, awake, trapped in a body breaking down by the hour. He watched his reflection pale. He felt every pulse of pressure behind his eyes, every fever, every muscle spasm. The king who once held court with ease now whispered through cracked lips, forced to speak in fragments between waves of pain. He couldn't eat. He couldn't drink. Food triggered cramps. Liquids brought nausea. Yet his body swelled, as if mocking the hunger within. The tissues of his gut were inflamed, ulcerated, leaking toxins into his bloodstream. His kidneys, overwhelmed, stopped filtering. His blood grew full. The physicians still applied leeches, still bled him, still forced him to swallow bitter concoctions, but nothing helped. His body was no longer malfunctioning. It was attacking itself. Systems that once kept him alive were now orchestrating his collapse. Lucid and gasping, Charles understood. The real enemy wasn't foreign. It wasn't treason or poison. It was his own flesh, rotting under royal robes. There was no escaping it, no outrunning it. The king who ruled with charm and steel was now a prisoner, his mind intact, his body in rebellion, and time running out. 8. Mistresses weep, ministers panic. Outside the king's chamber, the palace unraveled. Nell Gwyn wept in silence, her face buried in trembling hands. Louise de Querouaille stood pale and stunned, gripping the door frame as if it might collapse with her. They weren't the only ones. Courtiers murmured in corners, afraid to speak too loudly, afraid to leave. The king was dying, and no one knew what would come next. Inside, the groans continued. Every hour brought fresh agony. Charles gasped for breath. His skin yellowed. His body swelled. Those closest to the crown saw the truth first. This wasn't recovery. It was a drawn-out collapse. Ministers scrambled. Some prayed. Others schemed. With no legitimate heir, the question of succession loomed like a sword over every noble head. Whispers of poison spread through the corridors. Was it the Catholics, the French, a plot from within? But the autopsy, when it came, would tell a simpler truth. No blade, no cup, no assassin. Only time, only decay. What killed Charles was years in the making. Not a sudden strike, but slow erosion, organs worn down by indulgence, infections left untreated, and quack medicine applied like poison. He had lived too fast and treated his body like it owed him eternity. Now that body was turning cold, inch by inch. Outside his chamber, the mood shifted from denial to dread. The women who once warmed his bed could only sob. The men who once cheered his rule watched their power teeter on the edge of chaos. The merry monarch was leaving not with joy, but with rot and silence. England waited behind heavy doors, breath held. And as the king slipped further into darkness, the court that once danced around him stood paralyzed, helpless against a death that no crown could prevent. 9. The black sludge that shocked the surgeons. When Charles II finally exhaled his last breath, the palace exhaled with him. But peace didn't follow. The physicians, under pressure to explain his agonizing death, performed an autopsy. What they found silenced even the most seasoned surgeons. His abdomen was the first horror. When opened, a thick wave of black fluid oozed from his gut. It smelled of rot, chemical, foul, unnatural. His intestines were swollen, discolored, and lined with ulcerated patches. The internal walls were peeling, sections had liquefied. One surgeon described it plainly, an unhealthy mass of blackness. His kidneys, meant to filter life's waste, were bloated and deformed, misshapen lumps soaked in fluid, barely functioning by the time he died. His liver, dark and hardened, showed signs of long-term inflammation. His bladder had nearly disintegrated. They moved upward and found his brain congested, vessels bloated with stagnant blood. His body wasn't just diseased. It had turned toxic. Every system was choked, every organ overwhelmed. They concluded what was already clear. Charles hadn't died suddenly. He had been dying for years. His body had been poisoning itself slowly, drowning in its own bile, blood, and waste. No single illness did this. It was a cascade, a complete systemic failure masked for too long behind the strength of a crown. The merry monarch didn't die peacefully. He decayed from within, organs breaking down while he smiled at court and raised goblets in feasts. By the end, even death had to cut through layers of infection to take him. The surgeons wrote their findings with detached precision, but they knew what they'd seen. The King of England had rotted alive, his insides turned to sludge, his legacy smeared with the stench of untreated disease. No one ever looked at the throne the same way again. 10. The hidden cost of royal indulgence. Charles II lived like a man convinced he was immortal. He ate to excess, drank without pause, and indulged in flesh and fantasy nightly. Oysters at dawn, wine before noon, and rich meats soaked in butter filled his days. His nights belonged to mistresses, to velvet beds and candle-lit pleasure. Every appetite was fed, every warning ignored. He dismissed his ailments as minor annoyances. A stomach cramp here, a dizzy spell there. He treated pain with goblets of claret and court jesters. Doctors were summoned only when symptoms became impossible to hide. By then, the damage was well underway, and the so-called treatments made it worse. Mercury was fed to him for venereal disease. Lead was laced into his tonics. Antimony, a toxic metal, was brewed into bitter purgatives to cleanse his system. These weren't cures. They were poisons, silent assassins disguised as medicine. Every dose damaged tissue. Every remedy corroded him from the inside. The palace called it luxury. History now calls it suicide in slow motion. His immune system weakened. Infections lingered. His organs labored under constant strain. But Charles, proud and unshaken, pressed on. More feasts, more lovers, more wine. To slow down was to admit weakness, and he would not appear weak. What killed him wasn't a single vice. It was the accumulation, the indulgence, the refusal to listen, the arrogance of royalty, believing the crown shielded him from the rules of nature. By the time the truth emerged, his body was already past saving. Every celebration had left a scar. Every mistress, every meal, every medicine chipped away at his strength. The pleasure that made him legendary became the poison that destroyed him. He didn't die by betrayal. He died by excess, self-inflicted, royal, and final. 11th. A throne bathed in sweat and suffering. Charles II spent his last hours drowning in his own body. He lay motionless beneath embroidered covers, his skin slick with sweat, breath ragged, eyes flickering between delirium and lucidity. The fever had scorched through him for days. His lips were cracked, his voice faint. When he spoke, it wasn't royal decree. It was apology. "I'm sorry for being such a long time dying," he murmured. Those around him shifted uncomfortably. The king was fading, and there was no dignity left to preserve. His frame had wasted away. Beneath the silks and furs, he was skeletal. Ribs visible, limbs limp, stomach swollen with fluid. The room reeked of damp flesh and bile. Servants quietly replaced soaked linens while physicians hovered, useless and ashamed. There were no more treatments to try, only the slow descent. From the outside, the palace held its composure. Guards stood rigid. Courtiers whispered prayers. But inside those walls, behind the drapes, a monarch was dissolving. He hallucinated often, muttering names, recounting childhood, calling for women long gone. Then he'd wake with a jolt, pain overtaking the fog. He gripped the mattress, teeth clenched. The king who once danced at masquerades now flinched at candlelight. There were no last speeches, no grand declarations, just gasps, tremors, and silence. This was not how kings were supposed to die. There was no battlefield, no assassin, No noble sacrifice, just the slow breakdown of a body fed too much, healed too little, and pushed past its limit. The court waited. Outside, the kingdom held its breath, and inside, the throne, once the symbol of rebirth and glory, was now soaked in the sweat of suffering. Charles had ruled with flair and fire, but in the end, he left in pain, broken by the same flesh he once believed would never fail him. 12. Bloodletting and burned skin. The final assault, Charles II's final day, was not quiet. It was a barrage of pain disguised as treatment. The physicians, out of ideas and driven by panic, launched one last assault on his failing body. They shaved his head and blistered his scalp with caustic pastes, hoping to draw out the evil humors. They poured emetic potions down his throat, thick, bitter liquids meant to purge his stomach. He vomited blood. Hot irons were pressed to the soles of his feet, searing the flesh. He screamed once, then went silent. The burns left charred patches where skin once was. His pulse weakened. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. But the treatments didn't stop. They lanced boils that weren't there. They bled him again. Thin, dark blood trickled out slowly, the body nearly dry. They administered more enemas, fluids forced into a gut that hadn't functioned in days. Everything they did made him worse. His eyes rolled back, his hands trembled, his body no longer responded. The heat, the pain, the endless incisions, none of it helped. They were torturing a corpse, still clinging to breath. And through it all, Charles drifted in and out of awareness. Sometimes he spoke nonsense. Other times he stared blankly at the ceiling, lips moving in prayer or agony. It was hard to tell. No one knew if he felt the irons anymore. But they kept going, because they didn't know how to stop. What unfolded in that chamber was not medicine. It was ritualized desperation. The physicians were not healers. They were participants in the slow destruction of a man they had no power to save. Charles II, King of England, did not die with dignity. He died blistered, burned, and broken, a human experiment stretched to the bitter edge of royal endurance. 13. Legacy or legend. What they hid from history. History books prefer the legend. Charles II, the charming king, the witty ruler who restored joy to England after Cromwell's cold grip. He's remembered for his laugh, his lovers, his flair, the merry monarch. The mask never slipped, but the truth was different. His final days were a horror few dared record. Behind the scenes, palace scribes and courtiers worked quickly to shape a narrative, one of graceful passing, surrounded by loyal subjects and warm prayers. They buried the details, the black bile, the swollen limbs, the blisters, the screams. Royal journals omit the stench. Court painters never captured the sunken eyes or yellowed skin. Official statements blamed a sudden seizure, perhaps kidney trouble. No mention of the endless bleedings, the burns, or the poisoned blood. Even the autopsy was softened in translation, the mass of blackness in his gut quietly filed away. But the truth survived in private diaries, letters, and surgeons' notes. Eyewitnesses wrote of the king convulsing, vomiting, soiled in his own fluids. Some described the smell, others couldn't. It was all intentional. The monarchy couldn't afford a death like his. Not then, not when succession was fragile and faith in the crown was thin. So the rot was erased, the mask of mirth left untouched. Charles became myth, but the man died blistered and bloated, a victim of arrogance and medical ignorance. His suffering was not noble. It was unnecessary. Years of neglect, indulgence, and barbaric treatment had turned a vibrant king into a dying shell. What they hid was not just his decay. It was a warning about power, pride, and the cost of illusion. And though his body was buried in royal grandeur, the truth lies deeper, beneath the robes, beneath the legacy, beneath the carefully curated smile. 14. Could modern medicine have saved him? Yes, easily. Today, Charles II might have lived another 20 years. The symptoms he suffered, abdominal swelling, black urine, digestive failure, extreme fatigue, point to conditions now manageable. Crohn's disease, peritonitis, kidney failure. With modern tools, these aren't death sentences. They're chronic issues, treatable with antibiotics, surgery, and basic diagnostics. But in 1685, science bowed to superstition. The king's physicians didn't test. They guessed. Bloodletting, blistering, and enemas weren't solutions. They were rituals. His body wasn't examined for infection. It was drained until weak. His kidneys could have been supported. His gut could have been scoped. Instead, they fed him mercury, wrapped his feet in burning cloth, and treated every symptom as a moral imbalance. A modern hospital would have caught it early. Anti-inflammatory drugs for his gut, IV fluids for dehydration, dialysis if needed. No hot irons, no scalp blisters, no need to purge him 58 times in one day. Even simple hygiene could have spared him infection. But in the 17th century, doctors didn't wash their hands. Surgical instruments weren't sterilized. Every treatment brought more harm. Charles wasn't just a victim of disease. He was a casualty of arrogance. He trusted bad medicine, rejected restraint, and surrounded himself with men too afraid to say no. His pain was prolonged, his death avoidable. Today, patients with similar symptoms leave the hospital after a week of treatment. Charles was a king, but medicine did not spare him. It betrayed him. What killed him wasn't fate. It was ignorance, wrapped in ceremony, gilded by power. His organs failed in silence while the experts clung to ancient books. Had he been born 3 centuries later, he might have ruled longer, died gently. Instead, his body became a battlefield, and medicine his final enemy. 15. The king who laughed, then rotted. Charles II lived boldly. He laughed louder than his rivals, loved more than the crown permitted, and broke rules with ease. He danced through scandal, charmed his enemies, and restored a fractured kingdom with charisma alone. For years, he seemed untouchable, England's immortal reveler. But death came slowly and without mercy. He didn't die in battle. He wasn't assassinated. His enemies didn't bring him down. His own body did. From within, quietly, it turned against him. His intestines decayed, his kidneys collapsed, his stomach filled with bile and black sludge. He died bloated, blistered, leaking from every orifice. This was not how kings were supposed to go, but there was no hiding it. The stench, the screams, the rot, everyone in the palace knew. Some looked away, others rewrote the ending. They spoke of grace, of peace. But the truth still lingers. Charles II rotted alive, one organ at a time. After his death, his body was cleaned, perfumed, and buried with ceremony. The pain was scrubbed from history. The mask was sealed, but rot leaves traces, in letters, in diaries, in the trembling hands of the servants who washed his corpse. He had ruled with laughter. He died in agony. Charles's legacy survives, but so does his caution. Power couldn't shield him. Gold couldn't heal him. Wit, charm, and lineage meant nothing when his insides began to fail. He is remembered as a man of indulgence, but rarely as the man who paid its full cost. His story is more than legend. It is a warning. The crown may shine, but the flesh beneath it decays all the same. Charles II, the king who restored a nation, was finally undone by the one thing he never ruled, his own body.